Okay, so I wanted to go over the card sort activity from yesterday and talk about a couple things that we may have still been a little confused about. So you should have sorted your cards like this. They didn't have to be in any particular order, but the pairs did need to be the same as mine. Also, you did not need to label the different angle types, but I wanted to put them up here so that you can see how it related to the rest of the lesson. So the first pair you should have had was these cards 2 and 3, and they were vertical angles. We call these vertical angles. Okay, so these were in the same pair because they're angles formed by two intersecting lines and they are across from one another. Vertical angles are congruent, meaning they have the same angle measure. And so if you look here in card number 2, A and B are vertical because they're across from one another. A and C are not vertical. Those are actually supplementary. A and D are not vertical. Those are supplementary. C and D are vertical because they are formed by intersecting lines and they are across from one another and they are congruent. In card 3, A and B are vertical because they are across from one another. A and C are not vertical because they're not across from one another. C and D are vertical because they are across from one another and they are congruent. Okay, so one thing that was really important that I noticed some of us may have been confused on. For each of these intersecting lines, there are two separate pairs of vertical angles. And vertical angles do not have to be acute. There were a couple comments that I saw that thought that A and B were vertical because they were the smaller angles, but that's not necessarily true because C and D are also vertical angles with one another even though they are obtuse. Okay, so those were the misconceptions for vertical angles I wanted to make sure you guys knew before we moved on. The next set was adjacent angles. Adjacent angles share a vertex and a side or a ray. We can also use the word ray to describe that. So, for example, in this card number 4, they share this vertex that I'm pointing at and this ray. To be adjacent to something means to be directly beside something. So if I said I was adjacent to one of my friends, I would be standing right beside them. So these angles, angle 1 and angle 2, are adjacent because they're directly beside one another and they share a vertex and a side. Same with card number 7, okay? Angle ADB is adjacent to angle BDC because they share the vertex D and the ray DB, okay? One thing to note, there are no particular angle measures for adjacent angles. Some people were saying that because they were acute angles or obtuse angles, and that has nothing to do with angles being adjacent. There's no specific angle measure for this type of relationship. Also, complementary and supplementary angles can be adjacent. You see here, these complementary angles are also adjacent because they share this vertex and this ray. These supplementary angles are also adjacent because they share this vertex and this ray. Okay, next was complementary angles. Okay, these angles have a sum of 90 degrees. Remember, the box in the corner means it's a right angle, which also means it's 90 degrees. Okay, so if you see a pair of angles that forms a right angle, they are complementary. Okay, or if you see a pair of angles that has a sum of 90 degrees, they are complementary. So the key thing for complementary is a sum of 90 degrees. So I'm going to highlight that. So the key piece of information for complementary angles is that they are 90 degrees. Lastly was supplementary angles. Okay, both of these pictures show supplementary angles because they have a sum of 180 degrees. The key piece of information for supplementary angles is having a sum of 180 degrees. So I'm going to highlight that information as well. Okay, also remember, if you see a straight line, this is called a straight angle. Straight angles are 180 degrees. So if you see two angles that form a straight angle, they have to be supplementary because they are 180 degrees. Also remember, supplementary angles that look like this are also adjacent. Okay, one thing people talked about was like the direction that this was pointing, that this ray was pointing, and that has nothing to do with being supplementary. The key thing is that they have to be 180 degrees. So remember, complementary, 90 degrees, supplementary, 180 degrees. Vertical angles are equal to each other. So if this angle is 10 degrees, this angle is 10 degrees. If this angle is 60 degrees, this angle is 60 degrees.